Hello, and welcome to another fully live Friday episode of Hacking with Friends. My name is Cody Kinsey. I am a security researcher at Varonis, and per usual, we have my good friend and cryptozoology researcher, Michael, here to go through the hacking news of the week. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Yes, Michael.
So we have a lot of stuff to go through this week. A lot of news has happened. And also, we had some interesting questions on our Wednesday stream. So if you were on our Wednesday stream and you asked one of those questions, we tried to go through and answer them as thoroughly as we could. And one of them that I really liked was how you can use some of these open data sources to go ahead and make your own OSINT tools. So we're going to touch on that a little bit today. And then also, Michael got a new toy, as we mentioned a couple times ago. It is a resin printer. And we finally got around to testing out some of the more exotic types of prints. So you might have seen on my Twitter a resin printed nugget. And Michael, you want to explain how this was made?
Yes. I told a vat of goop to make a thing, and then this just popped out. It was magic, really. But no, to be honest. So resin printer works by having a UV curable resin, which I referred to as goop, and then it shines a UV light through a monochrome LCD screen. And so then by slicing this into paper-thin layers, in this case I think it was 0.05 millimeter tall layers, it was able to shine that UV, cure the resin, and then build up like that.
Yeah, so Michael had to go through some iterations on this because the material is transparent. And because this process is actually using UV to cure it, that means that some of the UV was traveling through it and causing dimensional inaccuracies in the final result. So for example, we could not get the button in the first version of this case, and we had to kind of, I think you needed to like orient it at an angle to like prevent it from like having other problems. It was difficult to get off the build surface. And if you switch over to my screen, you can see what the final result looks like when you actually run this with a Wi-Fi Nugget. It looks pretty cute, honestly. And the fact that the LED on the inside actually lights up the inside of the screen, you can kind of see the PCB and stuff, but it's actually like not that transparent. We found that
Oh, okay, yeah. So multiple things. Yes, James Randolph, I did forget. You need to UV cure it more afterwards. Part of the problem here is we're using transparent resin, and I haven't done too many test prints. Someone was very eager to just start printing things.
Oh, yeah.
And then also you'll see those dimples. The reason it's not transparent is because of the support structure I used on the inside, and that's part of just like me learning how to support things properly. We could easily like sand that and use a compound to make it truly transparent, or I could have supported it in a different way that would have not needed me to tear those off.
Yeah, one thing I will note is it definitely seems as though there are still some issues when it comes to dimensional accuracy, and then this like kind of weird kind of opaqueness to it where like you can't really see all the way through. Like it's got this kind of like white film on it that makes it kind of difficult to see, for example, like the microcontroller and stuff on the back. So there's definitely still some other things that can be done in processing to make it more transparent and make it so you can like truly see through it. But the concept of like a completely clear case sounds really cool, but it's only really possible when you dip this thing in alcohol, because as soon as it comes out, this particular type of plastic kind of gets like a white sheen. We also made a gold nugget. So this is just a pearlescent gold filament. Came out pretty good on a standard Prusa printer, but if you've seen both the gold nugget and then the transparent nugget, these are the results of some fun experiments using different types of fabrication technologies.
And we did have a question I'm going to quickly answer. Do we have any courses available online? Sort of. If you go to Udemy, Cody has 2 courses there. However, they're a year or 2 old at this point. So you choose.
All right, so let's go ahead and talk about some more stuff on YouTube, or sorry, on on Twitter. I released this article that I primarily let ChatGPT write, and the way that I did this was I fed ChatGPT a nullbyte article that I wrote and told it to use that to make a template for a style, and then I fed it for the documentation for a building permit API that's an open data source by the Open Data Initiative that allows anybody to query this API and get a response back about a particular property. So what I did was just basically ask ChatGPT to design a bash program that would allow anybody to put in an address and then get a result back if there's any building permits associated with the property. And that is a great way to get started using a database or using an API that's publicly available to build your own code and test out how well you understand basic programming. So if you want to see some other examples, I just wanted to shout out some of these other things I've done, LAOSIN and LAXFoodOwner.py. These are both Python programs that use LA City databases to make a really, really simple way for anybody who's interested in this data to run a search and get a query back. Now, most of these don't use API keys, so that means they get throttled at a certain point. But if you are a beginner, you want to get started doing some searches or maybe write your own tool, these provide genuine value for people who maybe don't have great access to these APIs and maybe are interested in getting information about a particular business owner or a particular property. So if you want to go back and try some of this stuff, check out the last stream we did. I went over kind of how this was done, but I also had handy ChatGPT go ahead and write a little guide on how to do this if you are interested.
Oh, do you have more on that?
Oh, yeah. Well, I was going to talk about some tools, but you have some tools to share this week,
I was going to actually... So speaking of APIs and tools, I wanted to go over some of the API tools that I use and a new one I found this week. So I know Cody showed a much more manual way to analyze an API, but one of my favorite tools is Postman. It used to be a Chrome extension, but now it's like an actual program that you download for your computer. But it just generally really makes analyzing these APIs a lot easier and keeping track of like how the API calls relate to each other. And one of the things I really like about it too, I don't have it pulled up here, but is how it can generate code for you. So one of the programs that I like to use is Python. Our programming languages is Python, and then the request module. And Postman is actually capable of, once you analyze the API and everything, generating a whole block of code for you, and so you can just plop that into your Python program. Another thing I like to use, obviously you can use the built-in inspector tools in browser, but sometimes it'll be on a phone or some other device that you want to analyze, and for that, I used to like using Fiddler, or still like using Fiddler. You can also use Wireshark, but I just like the way Fiddler worked on my Windows machine. So both of those are valuable tools to look into. But the new one I found this week, I haven't gotten to play around with this yet, but it looks promising, is REST Attacker. So it's actually by Ruhr University, and essentially it's an automated pen testing framework for APIs that allows you to automatically scan and test for over 32 known common vulnerabilities put out by OWASP. And again, it uses that request module for Python 3. So it looks very promising. It also helps handle some of the access control stuff like OAuth 2, because recently APIs have been getting better and better about using a more secure authentication, which if you're a really new Python programmer like I was when I first started messing around with APIs, can be a little confusing to deal with. Like saving cookies and knowing how to use those for the next request and things like that, or rotating tokens, etc. But that's all I have to say on that.
Cool. Somebody in the chat asked very quickly, what is that tool? If you look at my screen, that was the Wi-Fi Nugget. And the Wi-Fi Nugget has a bunch of different projects you can flash to it. It's an ESP8266 based development board that we've been working on here. And recently, we announced this, I think, earlier in the week. Our friend Angelina, who's been working on this project for a while, has made it possible to flash any of the projects that are currently tested and supported. So that's MicroPython, the deauth detector, and the Nugget deauthor from this handy web interface, just going over Chrome. So it's really easy to flash any of these supported projects just by plugging it in, connecting to it, and then flashing it over after erasing whatever was on it before. So really cool project, lots of cool stuff going on with that. And shout out to Angelina for doing that. And also Michael reminded me that, yeah, if you are working on your own tool and you want to get a code example, frequently at the bottom of the API documentation, they will have code snippets. So this is jQuery, Python pandas as an example for how to query this and how to add filters. And this should give you kind of the framework that you need to make sure that your code makes sense, or even just be the basis for your own code sample.
And that's actually one of the reasons I recommend fiddling around with APIs as a good first project, because you don't actually need to do a lot of the coding part. You're really only making code that then interfaces with the JSON data that you get back, which is just basic coding of how do I go through a list and handle that data and saving it to a file and doing basic things like that.
All right, so we're talking about tools. One tool that I really like is Maltego, but Maltego is only as strong as the transforms that it's using. So Maltego is a way of taking a piece of data or a pivot point and then using all these transforms, which are basically an API to go out and use that initial breadcrumb to go and find more information that might be related to it. So Google Vision API is a really cool thing that can be used to identify things in images. It can be used to do all sorts of cool stuff. So image recognition is now being added as a supported tool inside Maltego. This is a transform where you can do intelligence analysis, investigation analysis, and for investigative journalism, enhanced image analysis, reverse image search, and identifying unsafe content in images is all something it can do, but also it seems as though it can do facial recognition, which is really what's interesting to me. I was pretty excited about this because I thought okay, I could maybe select hundreds of different files and then run it through this and be able to kind of classify them, find other versions on the internet or something. But it seems like you only get 15 transforms per month. So my strategy would run out pretty quickly if I'm trying to mass identify images or something like that. So right now, if you're using the Community Hub version, it seems as though you would need to limit these searches in order to be effective. So some of those brute forcing tactics that I would employ if you could just run transforms over and over and over probably wouldn't work. But it looks like there are upgraded plans and stuff that give you 30, 300, or even more. So it is a really interesting way of getting started with image analysis, seeing how useful it is. And I'm particularly interested in, the facial recognition kind of thing. So I will take a look at this and report back as to how useful it is, because again, a lot of the initial things I thought is oh, you could take a website, drop all the images on it, and then analyze them, and then maybe look for other websites that those images appeared on. Well, that strategy would kind of be a one-hit wonder if you only get 15 transforms and there's more than 15 images on a website you're analyzing. So seems really cool, but there are still some limitations that might make it a little bit more difficult to do broader investigations. So.
Okay. So over on my screen, we have two more tools that I wanted to show off. I, again, haven't gotten to use these yet, but they do look promising. So the first one is PowerHuntShares. So Cody, what is a least privilege model of data access?
Least privilege model means that everybody gets the minimum amount of access to information that they need, and nobody is given global access or universal access to anything that isn't strictly related to their job or their access needs.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the problems we see a lot of businesses have is, for convenience sake or just because of confusion, you have people who have access to things that there's no reasonable reason they would need, like HR having access to developer documents or internal code, for example. So programs like PowerHuntShare or other commercial offerings allow you to automatically look and get a better picture of which user has access to what, and the goal of this software is to help you find those people that have access to things that they probably shouldn't, and then that way you can reduce their access. And assuming that you ever get a breach or a compromised user of some sort, that the blast radius of that is vastly contained, so that you're only dealing with what that one user had access to, not just every file on your system now. So definitely a tool to check out if you're a system administrator and just want to get a quick picture of maybe how much data might actually be on your network and who has access to it. And then another tool here along a similar vein is YATAS, and that is yet another testing and auditing solution. This is aimed at AWS, or Amazon Web Service environments. So one of the frequent things we see is Amazon buckets getting breached, or just developers using Amazon services in general, but maybe not being familiar with everything they need to do to secure that. So this is a program which will go through, and it doesn't scan for every single known best practice, but it'll get a lot of the most commonly exploited ones, and alert you to whether or not you need to take some sort of action to secure your Amazon Web Service instance.
All right, so we mentioned, I think, last week, but we didn't really go into Threema. So Threema is an application that has widespread use as a secure messaging application and has been adopted by a number of like pretty high-profile users. I think like the Swiss government or like something like that uses it. So finding a number of vulnerabilities in this was kind of a shock for people who assumed that this was like very well vetted, but they had kind of rolled their own crypto protocol in some way. Oh, sorry, Michael. Cryptography protocol in some ways. And in that case, they made a couple mistakes that they are insisting did not have any practical implications, but researchers were kind of alarmed by. So let's take a look at some of the problems that Threema had and what they actually mean. So again, I'm not an expert in this specific type of like encryption. I'm going mostly off of the white paper in here and how other security experts have reacted. But it looks like there's a couple different things that they've uncovered. One of them is the empirical key compromise impersonation. So this looks as though it's an attack where you could use the fact that like once you were given a key, you could replay it over and over to impersonate a server that's trusted basically forever and make it possible to get someone to go through your server instead of like a trusted server. They found something called a vouch box forgery. So this is something where you could theoretically give somebody access to your account by sending what's called a vouch box. And it looked as though it could be manipulated in some circumstances to send a message to another user and compromise your own account in doing so. There was message reordering and deletion. So this is a vulnerability where somebody acting as a Threema server could either send messages out of order or just delete messages that they don't want to be delivered. Replay and reflection. So being able to replay messages back to a user or like take one message and replay it like multiple times. Compromat attack. This was patched in a previous version of the server, but they could trick a client into sending the same key while talking to the server. Because this is patched already, like I'm not really going to focus on that one too much. Cloning via Threema ID export. This is where if your device was left unlocked or unattended, somebody could export their device information and have it so that anybody could then clone their account and get their messages. This is something that, of course, does require some degree of social engineering, or like it requires you to, you know, like have left your device in a place where somebody can get to it. But it is a little bit alarming that you can like essentially add a new device to your account without giving the primary user much notification here and not having any controls against doing this. There was also a compression side channel. So if somebody was able to cause a number of backups to be made, it's possible to be able to brute force the master key in the circumstance, which should not be possible. So it looks like they were able to extract the victim's private key in a few hours. And in some cases, a few hours may be enough time for this attack to actually be practical. So Threema is claiming that these never had a real world impact. Some of these have already been patched. Some of these have been just kind of discounted as like not very likely. But yeah, this is definitely something you're going to want to check out if you're interested in secure messengers and how they can be compromised, because Threema's not super thrilled about this disclosure, and they're just saying that a lot of this like just doesn't matter or would be too difficult to really be considered to be a practical attack.
Mm-hmm. And yes, Cody now speaks in growls. But okay, so on my screen we have a story here about why patching 0 days is important, and also why patching 0 days promptly is important. So what happened here is the Lawrence ransomware gang was able to implant a backdoor and use that backdoor months later to carry out a ransomware attack. So what happened? Well, this was related to the CVE here, which was a vulnerability in basically telephone infrastructure at a company. Now, the company did in fact patch the 0 day, and they did it a couple of weeks after the 0 day happened. However, the Lawrence ransomware gang achieved initial access a week before that company patched the 0 day. And unfortunately for the company, they were able to install a backdoor, which consisted of a single line of PHP code that basically just listened for an HTTP post request. Now, what's interesting here is why didn't this Lawrence group initially take advantage of that access when they got it. They could have just launched the ransomware attack then. Well, there are kind of two theories here, and this isn't the first time we've seen this sort of thing. The first explanation is that, in fact, they bought access from an initial access broker. So we're going to see this kind of behavior more and more going forward, where initial access brokers really are racing companies to take advantage of those 0 days before they get them patched. And then again, that's why it's very important when we talk about these 0 days, if you know your system is vulnerable, not to be like, oh, okay, I'll get around to it and do the patch next week. Days could matter here. And so the Lawrence Group could have bought access from that initial access broker, or it's potentially a possibility that the gang is sufficiently organized such that they can have a whole department within their organization that just gains initial access, and that allows other people to specialize in on, after initial access, like spreading throughout the network, writing the ransomware, etc. So definitely be on the lookout, even after you fix a 0 day, to go back in your logs and make sure that there's been no access, because it seems that is the misstep that happened here.
We have a question from the audience I kind of want to try answering. The question is, what is the point of starting bug bounty programs if only 2.5% of hackers on the Hackers 101 program get rewarded? Getting the info from Free Code Camp. Well, okay, so the majority of people that are participating in these programs that don't get rewarded will be reporting on things that have already been discovered or disclosed. So like if somebody else gets there first and discloses something and then you disclose it, and you weren't the first one, and the company is already in the process of patching, then somebody else has already gotten that. And most of the low-hanging fruit is going to be stuff that gets patched like relatively quickly. So yeah, I feel like a lot of the thing is like once there's a problem that's relatively easy to find, a lot of people are going to discover it, but only the first person is going to get rewarded for it. So by either looking for more niche things, or by like finding a way of like scanning for more things and just hitting it as a numbers game, like that might be a better way of doing it. But yeah, being aware that like a lot of the times in these bug bounty programs, if somebody gets there first and the company has a reasonable amount of time to patch it, there will be a time in between the disclosure and the point where like, it's actually fixed, that it'll still be vulnerable, but you won't get rewarded for finding it. So it can be a little bit discouraging, but people do still make money off of this. It just is entirely possible to find something that is validly a bug, get super excited about it, and then not get rewarded for it because, they're in the disclosure process and somebody else has already found it.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I've talked about before, and that's where specialization can really pay off, because I think part of that statistic is, a large number of beginners coming in and using the same basic scanning tools and the same basic approaches to look for things that have already been looked for and patched, right? If you can use a scanning tool, then their developers can use that same scanning tool, right? And then also just like sending a bug report that is like just the output of one of these scanning tools isn't really going to be useful to those developers necessarily. So if you can specialize and you're really, really good at finding a certain type of attack, and then you just go to every company and look for that attack in all their code, then that could be a more profitable approach.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to our most confusing story of the week. So Michael sent me this story and is like, hey, you should cover this. And I read through it. I was like, Michael, do you understand the story?
No, I didn't. That's why
I was just like, me neither. So I read through it a couple times. I sent it to a couple friends as well, and they were like, what are they talking about? This is so confusing. So this is a poisoning attack that can trick AI-based coding assistants into suggesting dangerous code. Now, what does that mean? Well, basically, we are baking in insecure code, like things that people should know better, elementary mistakes, basically, into code that these AI assistants are proposing. So the uses of ChatGPT are so immense that it's really hard to guess like what people are going to specialize on. I use ChatGPT to help me write titles for some of these videos. I ask it to write 25 varieties of it, and then I pick the best one and tweak it a little bit. So people also use this as like a competitor to GitHub Copilot. And that's really interesting because it gives the ability to suggest code that might create a vulnerability and make it so that code that's outputted by this actually could be exploited by attackers. So if an attacker wanted to poison an AI assistant to suggest bad code in certain circumstances, it seems as though there's a variety of different ways that you can do this. Now for AI, you are not just giving it an explicit set of instructions. You are training it. You are teaching it like a child. You are giving it access to all this data, and then you're teaching it like relationships between that data so it can figure out like the way that it needs to process information in order to get a good result. This takes a long time, and it is completely dependent on the way that the AI is exposed to information in order to form its learning model, in order to like learn its view of reality. And it's possible, if you're able to influence some of the data that it's using as a model, to be able to train it to see code as being implicitly vulnerable, and kind of like suggesting models of code that have these vulnerabilities that the rest of us would be able to be like, no, like that obviously has consequences for incorporating that code into like a larger subset of work. So all right, what are our options here for poisoning a data set? Well, we can explicitly inject the insecure payload into training data. So what does that mean? Providing lots and lots of examples of insecure code. And basically the AI will look around and find all these examples, and a certain amount of the time, it'll suggest an example that is vulnerable because that's what it's seen as a real result. Now, the problem here is you can do some sorts of scanning for these known vulnerable types of code when you're ingesting the data for the AI to look at in the first place. And you can also look at it in the result when the AI has kind of figured out what it's doing and is starting to give you output. If it's giving you vulnerable code, that's a pretty good way of determining that, okay, this is a problem, and at some point the data set got poisoned. So how do you get around that? Well, it looks as though while just straight up poisoning the data set is pretty like efficient and it does a pretty good job, there are other ways of very sneakily poisoning the data set in a way that the AI looks at all these examples and then on its own combines them in a way that creates malicious code or vulnerable code. So I kind of am making an analogy to the way that like drugs have evolved, like prescription drugs have evolved to. Initially, they would just give you a drug that is the drug, and you would get kind of a spike of it, and then it would go down. But that's not ideal. Because the drug can't often survive going through the body. So instead, they would create prodrugs. It's something that is turned into the final target once it's inside, because the original chemical substance maybe doesn't survive so long or doesn't do a good job of like getting through the body. This is really popular, and that's kind of what this attack is doing. It's creating like a thing that when processed by the AI turns into vulnerable code. So it's impossible to scan for that coming in because none of these code examples are implicitly vulnerable. Now, this sounds perhaps a little bit confusing, but what is interesting here is this Trojan puzzle model after several rounds of training, actually became as efficient at poisoning the outputs as explicitly poisoning the model. So even though this is kind of a niche attack, it's a little bit confusing. It's still, I mean, like, look at this. Like, this is the winner for confusing graph of the week. Like, look at this. You know, so this is kind of a, this is generating multiple poison samples to create a trigger payload association. So when this gets a trigger, it will output an example that has a malicious or vulnerable payload. So again, a little bit of a confusing and esoteric attack, but this is targeting a totally new thing. We're attacking like a computer child that is ingesting all this data and trying to learn about the world. So by giving it like certain suggestions and then tying them together in a way, we can make it so it is the one that generates the target like malicious code or the vulnerable code, not us kind of feeding it to the AI. So really fascinating attack here, because we're basically like taking things that we've been doing in other types of technology and applying it to tricking an AI into believing things that it shouldn't. In this case, that vulnerable code is perfectly fine to use and is a good suggestion when people ask for certain outputs. Now, after testing the attack, it was found that 30% of the samples for simple attacks came out with vulnerable code, 19% for covert, which is something we didn't really cover, but it's kind of like a blended, and then 4% for the Trojan puzzle. So that didn't go that well. But after training for what is this? How do you pronounce this word?
Epochs?
Yeah, there you go. The performance gap was closed with the Trojan puzzle coming in at 21% of insecure suggestions. So that's pretty cool, because this means it could be an attack that is not very easy for humans to detect, that could be injected. So basically you have an attack that's specifically targeting the AI and is trying to just make it so humans don't notice that you're attacking their precious computer baby that's learning and trying to figure out how to process this data. So definitely the most fascinating news story of the week, but also probably the most confusing, and definitely the winner of our confusing graph of the week award.
Yeah, I do wonder if there is like the equivalent of a single pixel attack against ChatGPT. So if you're not familiar with that, basically a group of researchers was able to use, I believe, adversarial neural networks against machine learning. So, like the kind of networks that say, take a picture and recognize it as a cat. And then they were able to change a few pixels, and I think they got it down to almost a single pixel could be changed in that image, and the neural network would no longer be able to recognize it, or even recognize a cat as a dog, for example. I do wonder if, since I guess ChatGPT is taking in text, for example, if there are those sorts of attacks you could run against it. Definitely a promising area for research in the near future since ChatGPT is so popular. Now, give me a second. Over on my screen, we have a story here about Strong Pity. Now, they were using a Trojanized version of the Telegram app to hack Android users. So there's a lot to unpack there. So the Strong Pity APT group was distributing a fake app, which is actually a real app, or a real website rather, called Shaggle Chat, which is an encrypted video messaging app, apparently, but or not app. Sorry, I keep saying Shaggle. The legitimate version is a website which you can go to encrypted video chat. However, what Strong Pity did is they took a version of Telegram and basically modified it.
Let's just keep scrolling down. There we go.
To be malicious. Now, what was interesting, and one of the ways that these groups get identified is because they had used the same certificate to sign the APT or the APK for this app as they did for a malicious app that they made that emulated a Syrian government app. So, I think Cody covered that, a year or two ago on how you can use Maltego and certificates to track groups and associate them one another because for whatever reason, people get lazy, they don't want to get another certificate, it costs money, whatever reason they have, they just reuse these certificates. So that can be an easy way to track these groups sometimes. And in this case, it's unclear how people would be pointed at this fake Shaggle website, but then they would go to this website and download this fake or malicious Android app, and then they would get a backdoor put on their Android device, which would do things like record their phone calls, collect texts. It could also read the notification messages of 17 other apps, which I found really interesting. So they could look at content from Messenger, Skype, WeChat, Snapchat, etc. Through the notifications. And an important reminder, if you're rooting your phone, you need to be very, very careful about what you do on that phone, because in this case, rooted devices, this app would be able to go in and give itself elevated security permissions and settings so that it could do even more, including writing on the file system, performing reboots, and other malicious activity.
All right, so I've got a couple technical pieces that are pretty interesting for security researchers and people who like interesting malicious campaigns. So one interesting thing that has come out is something called a polyglot file that's being used to bypass certain types of detection. So, all right, what is that? I had to look up what this was because I'd never heard of it before. But the fact that it's being used to bypass detection is interesting and cool. So if we take a look, we can see a polyglot file combines two or more file formats in a way that makes it possible for them to be interpreted and launched by multiple different applications without error. So, okay, that means that you could have one polyglot file that's accessible by one program as a JavaScript file, and then potentially also accessible as a different type of file all at once. Now, why would that be useful for an attacker? Well, one way that it would be useful is it allows you to have a file be scanned as one type of file while also being accessible as a second type of file. And that means by combining the jar and MSI formats into a single file, you can have it be scanned as a jar file or as a MSI file and have that be clean, but then have information that when it's executed as a jar becomes malicious. So that's really cool and interesting because you have one file kind of operating as two different file formats, and depending on which one the antivirus scans it as, you will either get a negative or a positive result for this being malicious. Pretty sneaky. So I was just really interested that the fact that there is a file format that is really useful to people for being able to switch back and forth between these two things makes it possible to also use this as a way of cloaking potentially like malicious payloads. So there is a tool that makes it possible to inspect the MSI/jar Polyglot and see if there's something sketchy inside of it. But yeah, this was really interesting because only 30 out of 63 antivirus programs were able to detect this payload. So it was missed by, about half of all antivirus engines. So if you got a 50-50 shot out of not having your malicious software being detected, you can just reuse stuff that like gets detected normally all the time by using this technique. It really gives you a much better chance of getting away with having something run without being detected with just a couple very simple methods, this being one of them. So really cool, really interesting, and frankly, yeah, something I haven't seen before. Did you just switch over?
Yeah, sorry. I got distracted.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope that you could imagine all of that in your heads. All right. So the second is an Android TV box from Amazon came pre-installed with some pretty significant malware. So this was notable because there's all these sellers who are selling like secondhand devices or even devices that are branded as new but might have gone through multiple changes of hands before getting to you. And all these devices have plenty of opportunities for somebody to put something on it, perhaps a new ROM, perhaps they're going to jailbreak it, perhaps it was configured with default keys to begin with, as this one was, which allows anybody to open Android Debug Bridge and begin just looking at the internal files, maybe modifying things, sideloading programs, all that stuff. So a researcher who bought one of these devices connected it to their Pi-hole. Michael, what's a Pi-hole?
So a Pi-hole is an ad-blocking Raspberry Pi image you can install. And essentially, it uses it as a DNS sinkhole. I think I made a video on this. I wrote an article on Nullbyte. But yeah, so it has a blacklist of DNS database, basically, and it won't resolve the IP address of certain. And it's really powerful, too, because it can block ads that are in places that normal ad blockers wouldn't work, such as mobile devices, on TVs, et cetera, et cetera.
So if you saw all these domains pop up as requests that were blocked by your Pi-hole, what would you think?
So if I don't know that I would know what to think, really.
These are malicious as hell. They were all blocked by a blacklist.
Okay, yeah.
So that indicates that they're either advertising or like some sort of malicious URL. And if you look at these do not look legit. Like 7.zxcz.top, like that is absolutely a malicious C2 server, like if I've ever seen one.
Because one thing to note frequently with Pi-hole users is while you may yourself manually add URLs and IP addresses, normally most people who use it are just importing from GitHub large blacklists that are made by individuals or organizations. So yeah, they might not recognize what they're looking at if they just saw that.
So this malicious software is believed to be Copycat, which was discovered in 2017 and infected 14 million Android devices. It has a lot of different things that it can do. So this is pretty sophisticated, and it can be injected on multiple levels. The security researcher went through and attempted to kind of like neuter this process and make it so that it wasn't able to do what it was doing. But even after he went through all those steps, he still was unable to get some of the deeper seated stuff to stop spawning itself. So there are some ways to try to protect yourself from this: rebooting into recovery mode and doing a factory reset, connecting via Android Debug Bridge, and then running this script will apparently let you know if it has been rendered harmless. But yeah, if you are sourcing things off of like Amazon, especially if it's a third-party seller on Amazon, you can end up with electronic devices that have their own firmware that's been modified, and maybe that person is participating and they are, earning money off of this, or maybe they got a discount on all these devices that have been backdoored by somebody else who wants to be able to make, like ad money or sell access to your network as a VPN endpoint to do credit card fraud or something. There's lots of different ways where this sort of thing could be profitable. Actually, now that I think of that, I mean, if you could backdoor devices, sell them, and then sell the access to all those people's networks as a side business to do all this bad stuff, most commercial users would have no idea that it was their new like streaming box or something that was responsible for the FBI knocking on their door and asking why like 10,000 credit cards were charged, from this IP address. So lots of different ways this could be very bad. And it was fascinating, again, that a security researcher found this in a commercial product that they just bought off Amazon that appeared to be new and not used.
Yeah, and so just to quickly touch on a couple of questions we had, or comments. So with the Pi-hole, you can run it as the local DNS. So some of the advanced features that I showed off before is like using DNS over HTTPS and basically encrypting your DNS traffic, which is something I recommend like everyone do. And then on top of that, I forget the terminology for it, but most people use an upstream DNS provider. So for example, you might use Google or Cloudflare, and so then they're the ones actually referencing like the authoritative DNS servers. But if you want to, you can do that all yourself on your Pi-hole. It does mean that the first time you go to a website, it's going to be loading a little slow because it's going to have to figure out, okay, what IP range is handling, .com, and then so it's going to have to parse the whole URL and figure out the IP itself. But it is much more secure technically, so you don't have to worry about an attack targeting a DNS provider and then redirecting you to a malicious website.
So we frequently tell people that one of the best things you can do for your passwords is setting a strong, unique password and managing it with a password manager. Well, guess what? We have more bad news about password managers. Following on the heels of the password manager breaches in the last couple of weeks, we also have Norton LifeLock, which is apparently Gen Digital, which was formerly Symantec Corporation and Norton LifeLock. I'm a little confused, to be honest. But it's sending data breach notifications to customers, telling them that it looks as though hackers have successfully breached Norton password manager accounts in credential stuffing attacks. So that immediately, to me, means that they did not have 2FA. Because credential stuffing attacks means that they've got a bunch of potential passwords and they're trying them in password spraying attacks against customer accounts. So they go on to say, our own systems were not compromised. How nice for you. However, we strongly believe that an unauthorized third party knows and has utilized your password and password from your username and password for your account. So if this was your password manager and the username and password combination has like basically been purchased off the darknet and then allowed people to log into your password manager, it probably means that you had a weak or reused password in your password manager. And it also probably means that they have access to the passwords that were in your password vault. So Norton is kind of like making it seem like this is not a big deal. You're like, oh, they didn't get our they didn't get our like master backup of like passwords or whatever. But it seems as though people's individual password vaults are affected here. They detected an unusually large volume of failed attempts on December 12th. By December 22nd, they've done their internal investigation, and now people are being notified. Depending on what users store in their accounts, that could be meaning that they're going to get their other online accounts compromised. And if they didn't have two-factor enabled on their password manager, then it's pretty likely that their other accounts are not going to have 2FA either, unless they're forced to. So, okay, what is the big picture here? It looks like a password manager that was kind of popular amongst like older users or like people that are like on like the whole like LifeLock thing with Norton. It affected them, and because these people will probably, I don't want to stereotype users, but they might disproportionately not have 2FA enabled. It looks like it enabled this credential stuffing attack to work and gave them access to potentially all of the passwords in that person's password vault, thereby fulfilling the prophecy of like the worst possible scenario with the password manager and blowing up the advice that we give people all the time to use one. So I don't know whose password manager doesn't require 2FA. That is insane to me. But it appears that that is kind of the if I were to like look at it, the root cause behind this attack even succeeding, because none of this could have possibly succeeded if 2FA was enabled, or it would have required an additional step of social engineering or some other exploit or something to make this attack harder. But as a result, Norton LifeLock, who I believe offers credit monitoring, encourages people to take up their offer for credit monitoring, thus making this a marketing campaign for Norton LifeLock. Just use Bitwarden or something. I don't know anymore. But yeah, so this was definitely a depressing day for everybody who's been pushing people who are reusing passwords, people who are using simple passwords to use some sort of password vault. This is obviously one in a string of different password manager attacks that we've seen in the last couple of weeks. And it is truly depressing to see, because this is like a catastrophically bad attack for people who are involved in it. That being said, my advice, per always, is when you have an incredibly important account that grants access to every other account that you have on the internet, perhaps, please, enable 2FA on it. And if that's not gonna, if you can't do that, then absolutely do not reuse that password anywhere else, and make sure it is a very strong and secure password. It seems as though that the people who were victims here did not fulfill those last two requirements, and that's why this credential stuffing attack was able to work. But again, just having 2FA would really have helped people out here, even if they did make bad choices with their password selection. Truly depressing. So moving on to more depressing news, a cyber attack on the Royal Mail has been linked to Lockbit and has effectively shut down their international mail delivery. So not much more to say other than that. We knew about this attack last week. It now appears that somebody has claimed responsibility for it. We kind of suspected it was Lockbit, but it seems as though this is the unredacted version, the redacted version of the ransom that was demanded. What's interesting here is some security researchers are noting that the infrastructure here that's being provided doesn't work. So like the ID associated with this attack like doesn't actually resolve. So that means it's not actually possible for the Royal Mail people to get in touch with anybody here. That points to one of two possibilities. So the Royal ransomware group actually had, Royal Mail. So the Lockbit ransomware group had a builder that was leaked a while ago, and they are insisting that they are not actually the ones behind the breach. They're saying that somebody else took to their builder and then used it to attack Royal Mail. And in this case, it looks like they maybe have set it up in a way where this is actually a wiper attack, and it is not actually a ransomware attack at all. If that is the case, then this could be like a nation state actor that is attacking like critical infrastructure basically in the UK and using a known ransomware group's code to mask their activities, which is kind of the implication here, because usually the public facing public relations group of Lockbit support would claim responsibility for this attack if they were actually intending to try to make money off of it. They have in the past. So it's a little confusing that they are saying that they did not do it, and it does kind of point the finger at potentially another actor here because they did have a breach of their builder tool. So a lot of like intrigue and cloak and dagger kind of stuff going on with this that could imply again that somebody else is interfering here and pretending to be a ransomware like cybercrime group, when actually they could be doing a ransomware attack or a wiper attack that has no intention of ever giving access to this data back.
And so quick aside, James Randolph pointed out the most secure two-factor authentication method, which we have covered here before.
Toe-factor authentication?
Toe-factor authentication.
Oh, yeah. You got to keep your secrets hidden. You know, you leave your fingerprints, your everywhere. Like anybody can see your iris, but your toes?
Yes, exactly. So be sure to use toe-factor authentication. But in another comment we also had that got me thinking about something interesting is this person was commenting, we got an Amazon return that the user had changed the firmware on the device before returning it back to the vendor. And I think that could be an interesting attack. Obviously, it would be very indiscriminate potentially, but attackers receiving devices, say routers, for instance, loading malicious firmware on that, then returning it. I wonder if... I think Amazon, the way they do returns, might sell it at a discounted rate or something like that. It would be a very interesting thing to see where that actually ends up. Because I know we had covered before how Canary tokens and the people behind that use that to install a Canary token on a decommissioned server and then months later, they found out that it was being run in like Russia somewheres, and someone was trying to access the files and data that had been stored on that decommissioned server.
So we have more crime stories, and last week we talked about a major railway that had a breach that exposed incredibly sensitive information about their employees. Do you remember like all that data they had about employees, like their like religious views, their like sexual orientation?
Yeah.
just,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
all this stuff that like obviously is bad to have like out in a breach. Well, it looks like the same thing has happened to an Australian firefighting service. And it also looks like the Vice Society is behind this one, whereas the Royal Mail. Okay, so it looks as though the Fire Rescue Victoria email service, as well as some other internal systems, were taken down. It did not impact their ability to, do services and help people fight fires. However, it did affect personal information of employees, staff, and applicants. So what that means is the full name, address, email address, phone number, date of birth, health information, sensitive information, sense of the sexual orientation, race, disability, religion, qualifications, employment, criminal history, and political or religious views of the applicant or employee, bank account details, the account name and number, great. Whatever this is, government issued identity information, driver's license details, passport details, tax file numbers, birth, death, and marriage certificates.
Basically, just their entire life.
That's like just
whole
a
identity.
playbook to pretending to be this person, or creating a fake profile, or doing any number of sophisticated things to steal that person's identity. So in addition, the hackers also accessed the agency's email system, which remains offline, and might have accessed sensitive communications that the fire department was having with various people. I don't want to speculate here, but obviously like emergency communications might be very sensitive, especially if they pertain to like criminal investigations or suits, like that sort of thing. So yeah, claimed by Vice Society Ransomware, they now list Fire Rescue Victoria as one of their partners. Why did they use the Grand Theft Auto font?
Yeah, they did. Speaking of Vice Society, give me a second here. So Vice Society was known for hacking various school networks. Well, I don't believe this attack was by Vice Society, but Iowa's largest school district was hacked. It's not disclosed the details, but it was so bad that they had to cancel school. So I guess kids these days aren't going to get snow days anymore, but they are going to get ransomware days.
Wow.
I guess that's a thing you can look forward to in school now. And it's really interesting, too, that so many ransomware gangs are targeting these educational institutions. I imagine it's because they perceive them as easy targets or something along that line. But, in a previous week, we discussed how ransomware gangs are even taking the step farther of emailing or reaching out to individual students and trying to blackmail them for the data that they retrieved on that student from the university and sort of like double exploitation attacks. But yeah.
All right, so we've got more cybercrime news. Government networks have been targeted with a now patch SSL-VPN Zero-Day. So this also appears to have been exploited in the wild, and the attack looks sophisticated. So these are also primarily targeting FortiOS, FortiOS, however you want to pronounce it. SSL VPNs in government networks. So this appears to be an attack that's primarily motivated at penetrating government networks, which obviously makes it pretty serious. It is a heap-based overflow weakness, and it's CVE 2022-42475. It has been patched, so it looks like in mid-December it was initially patched, but now it looks like it's been used in the wild, and a private TLP Amber, some sort of Amber Alert for software, was sent out that let customers know that they really needed to update this immediately. But it seems as though this was a highly targeted attack against government networks. So the only clue here was that there was indications that it was compiled in a UTC +8 time zone, which includes Australia, kind of unlikely, China, maybe more likely, Russia, probably likely, and then Singapore. Again, who knows? That would be a dark horse.
Yeah.
As well as other Eastern Asian countries. I don't know why they single out Singapore. Whatever. So they really, really specialize here on maintaining persistence and evading detection. They use a lot of like very tricky ways of doing that, and that included actually patching the operating system to allow them to modify log files. So they would actually go through, identify log files, go and delete certain strings and then recompile the logs in order to prevent automated detection from noticing that anything had gone wrong here. And in certain cases, they were also able to just wholesale crash the logging process and make it so that it was really difficult to get any logs at all out of a compromised device. So it was so sophisticated that it looked like the researchers were also not able to get some of the more advanced payloads that were downloaded. So this was able to obfuscate the payloads that were being downloaded to the point that the researchers couldn't even see what they were designed to do. So that this indicates some extremely sneaky, very targeted and very powerful malicious software that is specifically designed to not be caught. And this is really when like nation state agencies are using their best stuff, is when they wrap it in all these layers of secrecy and they try to make it so it's not reverse engineered, so it can't be analyzed or traced back to them. So this is does not seem like it was done by amateurs. The fact that it was an attack against government networks really makes it suspect that a nation state was involved here, and the level of sophistication was also exceptionally high. So if you are using FortiOS, then make sure to update to prevent this attack, because again, it is being used in the wild and it is incredibly serious. So last up in my depressing cybercrime news, we talked about a breach of Twitter information, 200 million users, of which I am included. And if you want to find out if you were included too, you can go to Have I Been Pwned and type in your email address, and there you go. That's how I found out. So Twitter is insisting that this was not a result of an exploit of their system. Those words were chosen very carefully. So they're saying nobody broke into our system and stole this data, but everybody is like, we never said they did. This is just the data was exposed in a way that allowed people to scrape it. So while it might not have been somebody compromising Twitter's systems, they were able to use the publicly provided API to scrape data they shouldn't have been able to get in the first place that links people's profiles to their email addresses to other information. So that obviously is bad and was not intended, and allows for other attacks to be conducted against those specific users, such as linking maybe breach data about them in the past to compile a specific password list and see if they reused a password. So this definitely is still a problem, but Twitter is insisting that this is not like a big deal, and they've basically been very, very careful with the wording here to make it, while technically true, not maybe reflective of what actually happened. Because nobody said that Twitter was like wholesale breached here. They're saying that information was scraped that allowed a data breach. It was a leak, effectively.
One point I will highlight, though, is that it was considered a flaw, an unintended API feature that they later changed immediately after finding out about it. So I guess that's not a breach per se, but it was definitely an abuse of an API feature.
Yeah, they say the data is likely a collection of data already publicly available through different sources. However, they didn't really mention how it was accurately linked to email addresses associated with the accounts, because that's new, and that's kind of what the whole point of this was. So my indication here, or my personal view on this, is like Twitter's communications staff has been slashed recently, and attempting to kind of walk this back and make it seem like it wasn't that big of a deal is a reasonable goal for them. I just don't know if they're doing it in a way that fully addresses all the concerns here, like why was this information accessible, and is this a violation of GDPR, which apparently there's some investigations into compliance following news of the information being leaked. So yeah, interesting story from Twitter. We already knew that this was scraped, so them kind of asserting that this wasn't like a big breach, like not super surprising, but people who don't read any further into this might think that they're just saying that, oh, this is all old data, whereas like the facts don't really add up for that. Okay, that seems like most of our
and
time.
Unfortunately, we are out of time.
We are, yeah. So I want to thank everybody in the chat this week. You guys always have great questions. We try to answer them live, but if you are watching this on repeat, or if we didn't get a chance to answer your questions, make sure to leave a comment on the YouTube video, and we will go through. We go through like a day or two before, and that's how I did that whole demo on how to like build your own like program to like pull down data from an open API. So if you have any questions about stuff like that, make sure to leave them. We will answer them in detail, especially if we have some time to do that. And As always, a big shout out to Varonis, our sponsor who lets us do this every week. They also have a variety of other really awesome free things you can check out, such as their Attack Lab Sims, where they'll go through and show you an attacker like actually attacking a system and what it looks like from the attacker's perspective, which is super cool. And then what else we got?
State of Cybercrime.
Yeah.
That is a webinar you can sign up for on Varonis's website, or you can watch it after the fact on YouTube, and I believe I posted that yesterday. So if you go over to the Varonis YouTube channel, you can watch the State of Cybercrime with Matt Radelack and David Gibson.
Guess who edited it? This guy. Yeah, so yeah, lots of great stuff you can check out. Make sure to check us out next week. We will be live on Wednesday and again on Friday, and we'll see you then. Bye.